And I'm hitting the record button. So as always, were there parts from the scripture that touched you or that you were curious about, or parts from the video?
Well, I have some random thoughts. The video, I kind of was struck by his comment that addiction to sin, because I've never thought of sin as being an addiction. It kind of makes sense to me then to think of it that way, because it seems to be so hard for us to break that temptation to do those things that we call sin. And this was a great chapter and a great read. I thought it had so much in it. It's hard to say what struck me the most, but one thing I did in one of the questions was about the Sabbath and what keeps you from keeping the Sabbath. And I think it's, for me, it's that idea of rest as being idle rather than rest being a useful thing. And I really just kind of had that in mind. Darlene, I know you have some enlightenment for us.
I don't know that it's enlightenment, but it's some
Always.
concern. I have trouble with the concept of addiction being a sin. I can see the thinking that addiction can lead us to sin. Addiction can hurt us and others. And but I don't see addiction as sin. I see addiction as an illness. That, not that my view is right, but it's just my view. I think theologically we could talk about why it could be thought of as a sin, but I just can't go there.
So are we okay? Do we want to talk about this point a little bit? Because you've probably got other things you've been thinking about from the reading, but this is an interesting thought, I think. It takes so much nuancing. Maybe I can back into it. A couple of weeks ago, I had mentioned that it's possible to translate the word curse as bless and vice versa, and that Job's wife might just as well say, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord. And Job could say, why do you keep your integrity, curse God and die? Could also say, bless God and die. And Job could say, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord, but could say, cursed be the name of the Lord. And somebody followed up and said, well, it says Job didn't sin, and isn't cursing God a sin? And I thought about that, because if you read the rest of the book, he pretty much just goes on and curses God the whole book. I mean, let's just be real about it, right? He complains, God is not fair, God's not just, God won't even show up. All that sounds kind of like cursing, but throughout the book, he doesn't sin. And I've been thinking about that. I think if we are stuck with sin being a blot on a garment, that's foreign to the text anyway. I'm not sure it's helpful or healthy thinking, but if we think about sin as being a weight that we carry, or if I want to use like a neuro way, like there's some neuro pathways that we travel down so often that we lubricate those pathways. It's called myelination. And it means that we'll travel down those pathways like 50,000 times faster than a new one, right? So this is why breaking an old habit is so hard, because you've been doing it for so long that your brain expedites your doing it, right? And addiction is that. Addiction is like a neuro pathway that's like gone from a country road to a super highway or a bullet train. I mean, you're doing it, your brain's doing it before you even know you're doing it. This seems like a much better way of understanding sin. It's not about a moral blot. It's about the super highways we've built that go nowhere.
And it causes pain. It causes damage to us and to others.
They do. But I think it's not like a moral transgression as much as it is like a highway to nowhere.
Yeah.
And so the question is like, what road work do we need to do? Or how do we redirect our traffic flow, both in our brains and with communities and people we love, to get us somewhere? But what was so hard, right, is like the word sin is so myelinated in my own brain as wrong with you. Stain.
Bad person.
Bad. God
person.
hates. Yeah. So like trying to even take the vocabulary seriously means we got to do road work on our interior spiritual map that frankly is covered with sin. Roads that take us nowhere, but we travel them real fast. I don't know if that's helpful.
It is very helpful.
Trying to have that positive view, it's a lot easier to do with somebody else, but we're so used to like processing people we know and love and ourselves in these myelinated roads, superhighways to nowhere, that changing the traffic flow is really hard. My experience.
Makes sense.
I mean, it's funny because it's easy to beat up on addicts, right? But then there's like socially acceptable addictions, like workaholism and perfectionism, and people don't usually beat up on those folk, right? Because what they're producing out of their problems is like socially beneficial, or we perceive it to be that way. Dora. Anyway, so I don't know if that's helpful. And by the way, feel free to agree or disagree with that, both of y'all.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And oftentimes my previous religious training jumps in and takes over my mind. That sin word is one of those big ones.
It does for all of us. And I want to suggest when that happens, that actually is sin. And it doesn't mean like you need to go like wash yourself in some kind of river. It's like an awareness that I'm carrying this burden so much, I don't even know how to put it down. Yeah. This idea that cursing God is a sin is a really interesting thought when you consider that like what you do for somebody you hate is ignore them. And actually like cursing somebody implies a connection. Right? Like if I really hate somebody, then I'm going to ignore them. If I'm injured by somebody, right, and I'm mad, it's because I wanted a connection, and I probably still want that. Otherwise, I'd just move on. So like the act of cursing is like an intimate thing. So it's like interesting to think like, well, is it sinful to curse God? Because after all, can't God like handle that? And if I'm taking the time to express, it's because like I'm just, look, maybe I could make better choices, but really what that chooses is like a desire for a relationship or for my needs being met that aren't being met.
For me, it's an indication of pain, emotional pain, and the cursing is the first step in getting that out in the open and on the table so that we can look at it and see why this happened and how we can keep it from happening. And it's the first step in reconciliation for me, is expressing that pain. And so for me, the cursing God would be an effort to reconnect with God.
Yeah.
To say, this is how I feel. I don't want to feel this anymore. Take this from me. Help heal me.
Yes. Just like it would be when you curse another human being. Usually yes. It means like there's a lot of pain that's come here, but I'm taking the time to express that pain.
And I'm being vulnerable enough to do it.
Yeah.
It's easier to walk away. it's easier to ignore. For me, it is. I mean, my first inclination in a conflict is to leave, leave emotionally, leave physically. But I have to change my thinking and think, no, this is worth feeling the pain for. This is worth moving toward. This is worth expressing the pain and feeling it so that maybe we can reconcile.
Yeah.
But it's my second choice. My first choice is to leave.
Yeah.
In the Psalms, don't the Jews or the writers of the Psalm, don't they continue to curse God a lot?
There's a few of those. Those are called imprecatory psalms, like they're given their own category. Sometimes they curse other people. Usually they end up with like, this is really not just, I'm going to praise you anyway, hint, hint, like do the right thing, God. But they don't always, sometimes they just end in a stink. We don't usually do those on Sunday mornings, just by the way. I'm going to tell you another thing we've myelinated religiously is the word 10 commandments. And it's terrible that we use that phrase because it's not biblically, they're not commandments. These are called the 10 words because in Hebrew, they actually are 10 words. Like do not murder is the word kill plus like a prefix for not. So this is how you make it one word, not kill. When you look at the things in Hebrew, they could fit on a tablet pretty easily because they're not sentences. They are 10 words. It's really interesting to think like, hey, if you've been a slave your whole life and the master's wish is your command, you hear a suggestion and you turn it into a commandment. But I think I've mentioned this to you before in church. These are like minimums, but the best way to make sure I don't infringe on these commandments is to not know my neighbor. Because if I don't know anything about them, easy not to kill them, easy not to covet, easy not to steal from them. But boy, that's like I don't think these 10 words are designed to keep us in isolation, even though that would be the easiest way to comply with them. These seem to be minimums. You know, I used to think this was silly, but you know, when you ask people like, what 10 words would you come up with that should be universalized for human experience? Usually you don't get these. You know, like to me, when we think about like a commandment is love one another as I've loved you. So I've heard some of our Jewish brothers and sisters call these the 10 commitments. But in Hebrew, you use not commandments, not.
Well, I find the order of them interesting too.
Yeah.
You know, it didn't occur to me that the order of them had any relevance. But after I read the book here, I began to think about that and said, yeah, you know, that it kind of makes a sense as to how they're structured.
There's a little bit of weirdness, if you don't mind. Like I'm going to say, I think this is pretty much like an anthropomorphization of God, right? Like this phrase, I'm a jealous God. I'm not real comfortable with that, you know, because like my understanding of jealousy is that it actually comes, jealousy is like the opposite of compassion. And the remedy for jealousy is curiosity. And I sure would like to think that God is pretty good about being both compassionate and curious.
If he says, I am a jealous God, doesn't that presuppose that there are other gods?
Well, for sure, right? And that's what you're finding. Actually, the first commandment, as we call it, is weird. It's not even a command. It's like, I'm the Lord, you'll have no other gods before me. But what about the ones after you? Is this sort of like, I'm the first one in line of many? but I'm jealous. So look, you can have concubines, but I'm the only wife. I mean, it's like a strange thing. And remember that when these were like the origin story, the Jewish people were not monotheist, right? These are like during polytheist times, right? I don't know. I'm just not, it's like God gets angry and like kills people. I'm not real comfortable with that. And I'm not real comfortable with the idea that God is jealous, because usually jealousy means there's something going on inside of you that needs healing. And if God is the source of healing, it's just hard to imagine God being jealous and vindictive.
Well, perhaps it was written because that's how those people at that time understood the way they gave God some human qualities so they could understand him better.
Yeah, I mean, I think the sociologist that I've most read is that people create gods in their own image, rather than being created in God's image. And that's an interesting conversation to think about,
Well, I think that's the way all religions probably started. It was a way of kind of explaining the world around them and giving them some structure. Now, all religions didn't go that particular way. Some of them were a lot more violent. You think about the Aztecs and the things they did. So, right here, I think was designed to bring some structure to the tribe so that they could live in harmony with each other.
Mm.
This may be way off the mark, but my interpretation of jealous in this instance is that God is enfolding his people and protecting and guarding them. And that's a way of being like, you other gods can't have my people.
That's an affirmative translation. I mean, that's a really interesting thought.
Good for you, Ellen. I had never thought of that.
I don't know why I have that feeling about that word, but there it is. And I never thought about the 2 tablets, but in this reading, it was so good to read the second set because there were the proscriptions and the prescriptions, don't do this, and then you will receive this, or it's possible that this could happen. Mm-hmm. I like that a lot better than don't.
Yeah, thank you. You mean like when we read them in Deuteronomy and there's a little more exposition?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But it was also interesting to see the illustration of the tablets with just the words. And I was thinking that'd be a really great thing to have on the wall or on your desk, or just the words, and a way not to get bogged down in minutia.
Thank you. I just want to repeat that the idea that because there are other gods out there, God is jealous to enfold God's people. That's a lovely thought.
I want to be enfolded. I know that.
Yeah.
It's a comforting thought to me when I am feeling like I need to be enfolded and nobody is doing it, no human is doing it for me.
Yes.
I can go there. That's a real comfort to me.
I'm with you, Ellen. in times of my deepest despair, some really, really dark times, I can remember vividly just crying out and say, hold me, wrap your arms around me, hold me close.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have that same image and that same need when no one else was there.
There's a lovely prayer Mike Ludy put up on Facebook from Thomas Merton this week. Good shepherd, you have a wild and crazy sheep in love with brambles and thorns, but please don't get tired of looking for me. I know you won't, for you have found me. All I have to do is stay found.
Oh, that is lovely.
Oh, can you send that to us?
Yeah, it seems like that's one of those things I want to put on. I need to put that in the liturgy. That's probably going to be something we do in Lent.
Okay.
Like that'll show up in the service all Lent long, because that's a
Oh, that's beautiful.
thought.
That makes me cry.
Yeah.
That makes me cry.
But I'm going to put it in the
That
chat
touches
right
me.
now.
Okay.
It's interesting to think, and this is where I think sometimes we can read the Bible prescriptively or descriptively. That bit of the jealous God, I'll pass sins on to the next 3 or 4 generations, but righteousness on to the next 100. That seems to just describe how things pretty much work, to be honest. I'm not sure like God's inflicting that punishment, but I do know that like when you grow up in a violent home, the odds are you're going to be violent. Like children who observe, this was crazy for me to think about. Children who observe violence from one parent to another are like 4 times as likely as to be violent when they're married against their spouse. Instead of learning from their parents' mistakes, like we somehow find ourselves in that rut. And that seems to describe human beings pretty well. I didn't think that God inflicts that. I just think that's kind of nails what we do.
That helps a lot in that punishing to the 3rd and 4th generation, because that seems so harsh. And yet when like what you just said, when you think about it, children learn from their parents, and so that's how it gets passed down. It's not thrust upon us, it's the way we live.
I mean, when you think about fetal alcohol syndrome, especially in indigenous peoples, I mean, that's just descriptive.
Yeah.
And that was a thing done to them that generations ago that, their progeny are still paying the price for.
And I think the domestic violence is the same way.
It is. It's crazy to think about that.
I use those statistics when I'm working with women in abusive situations who tell me, but I have to stay in this for my children. I don't want my children to come from a broken home. I mean, to me, sharing those statistics with the person who is hesitant to leave for the children gives them a whole nother way of looking at what is happening to the children. It's more damaging to stay in the abusive relationship than it is to leave.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's really helpful to hear. And that's a hard truth.
Yeah.
Particularly when we grow up, again, myelinated that family's everything.
Yes.
And then to like get a divorce, from somebody who's abusive is like the shame of that.
Yes. And the person choosing to leave is shamed.
In both
choosing...
inside and outside, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, since it's I started to say only us, but it isn't, but I'll share it anyway. I found that true when I chose to divorce. The abuse in our home was not physical, or even overtly verbal, but it was a representation of what a relationship between a man and wife should be. And I realized that I was teaching my children
Yeah.
that this is what they could expect.
Yes.
And it would be so hurtful to them for me to continue that it was better for them for me to leave. And that's a hard thing, particularly when outwardly society looks at you and says, "What are you doing? You know, what is wrong with you?"
Mhm.
So that seems to apply.
I've had a few friends who have even publicly posted like, I'm leaving this marriage for my children.
Yeah.
They don't even talk about themselves. It's interesting to think, like, as a mom, particularly, right? You may not feel like you can do something for yourself, but being able to do it for your children can be the
Yes.
liberative tact that you need.
Yes.
Somehow in my mind for a time, it was like, well, I deserve whatever I got. I made this choice to enter this relationship, but my children don't deserve it.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. That takes a lot of vulnerability to say, but it rings true to me.
Well,
Me
you
too.
know, some things are hard to talk about because I don't want it to reflect badly on my husband because he was a good man. We just were mismatched. We weren't able to relate to one another. Well, he's not around any longer, so I feel I can share those things and not be hurtful to him. Ultimately, we became very good friends and shared raising our grandchildren together, and you know, it was very interesting. We just weren't able to be married to each other and have that kind of relationship, but we could have a friendship.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Is it okay just to point out a couple of things, and maybe you're interested in it or not, I don't know.
Please.
You notice there's a firm commandment to not make an altar out of hewn stone or permanent. And just keep that in mind, because later David's going to build a temple with a hewn altar, and just that's a violation of the Torah.
Interesting.
And
And rebuild them.
sometimes we say God wanted that temple, but when you read through Kings, God's like, I don't live in a house built by human hands. And then Solomon builds it anyway. So it's interesting to think about how that changes, right? And maybe the remedy is that we build altars everywhere. I don't know. And that's how we need to do it, so that we don't think that one place is more important than another. I don't know. I don't know if you noticed that Aaron lies about making the calf. Well, I just threw it in the fire and it came. I mean, that's a bold-faced lie. And then he's like so passive, like the people made me do it. Like,
What was he doing all that time?
I think you did that. In fact, when you read the story, he says, give me all your gold and I'll make a god for you. And then he lies. And that's where priests come from. That's where we come from.
I was laughing when I read that, and out came the calf. Like, really?
Yes.
It just mysteriously appeared. I had nothing to do with it.
And then notice the Levites go and kill their brothers. That's where priests come from. Not a good origin story, Lee's not. And Aaron doesn't get punished. That's the interesting thing. He did it. He doesn't get killed. He doesn't get punished, and he lies about it. Yeah, that's descriptive. Bible describes us.
So why would anyone ever want to be a priest?
Oh, because you can do whatever you want and blame your people. Yeah, I know. And then you get a raise, or you get a diocesan job. That's why. I mean, I know I sound like I'm kidding. I'm not actually kidding. That's the sad bit, right? I mean, like these are origin stories. I'm not even forcing this on them. Like they're not even hidden. They're like at the surface level read. This is not good.
I'm glad it's not always true. Where would we be?
Well, it's not always true, but there probably is always some truth to it, right? And it's interesting to think about, do we choose when we do something wrong, do we choose to take ownership of it, or do we blame our people? And we don't have to make that choice. And maybe this is saying, look, Aaron continued, he doubled down on bad decisions. And you can say, like, I did that. I don't know what would have happened.
I think it's true that it is human nature to lie and try to get out of it, to not take responsibility. But it is also true, like you said, we can make a conscious choice to go beyond our basic human nature and rise above it and make choices to do better things.
I think I would push you on that point, if it's okay, and say,
sure,
I'm not sure it's inherently human nature. I think it's myelinated neural pathways that we've learned from our parents and social media that you blame other folk.
Yeah.
And that I think we actually could change if we said corporately, I'm going to choose to take responsibility for my part in decisions. And if the response to that was, there's accountability for that, but your fundamental dignity has not been lost.
Yeah, I think, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, please.
I think we, the people, bear some responsibility for this happening because we tend to put our leaders, priests, on a pedestal and expect them to be perfect and make no mistakes. And then, that's just a setup for, oh, you've disappointed me. You're not really all I thought you were. And what a burden to put on you as a priest, just we need to.
How we handle that's really tough. I try to tell people, they're like, oh, I just love you. I'm like, well, you're going to be disappointed. Well, you could never disappoint me. I probably will. And that's like a really, people don't like being pushed to hear that. They're like, well, what do you know that I don't know? Well, myself, I know myself. Because I disappoint myself all the time. So the odds are I'm going to disappoint you too. But it is tough. And like you say, it's like a cultural thing we've accepted. And it was even stronger 30 years ago, Father knows best, right? And so, yeah, how we wear that together seems kind of important.
I think it is. And like you say, it's a cultural thing. We've been for centuries. Somebody has to be, up there on that pedestal as the leader. And it doesn't allow you to be human. And then you can't have a relationship.
Yeah.
They're not a genuine relationship.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because I was talking to somebody yesterday at clergy conference who said to me something like, yeah, because, you're like, when you're having a hard time personally, like your people of your church can't really take care of you. And I was like, I think that's a lie. I was raised with that lie, but I think it's a lie. There's a difference between them being your therapist and then being in communion together, right? And so them being your therapist, not great, unless that's really what they do. But look, if you can't receive stuff from them, I'm not sure you can actually give them anything anyway. Well,
and allowing yourself to be taken care of by others in appropriate ways, bits and pieces, is a gift to them. I really feel that your vulnerability with your father's death has been a gift to us. Two ways. One, it shows us your humanity, and we can relate better, and it allows us to do what we can to show you that we love you. But it also, secondly, gives us a model for how for alternatives for dealing with death and family issues. So it's a teaching model.
I appreciate that. I
It's
didn't.
really beneficial to us.
Well, thank
It's a
you.
gift to us.
Thank you. This is part of the thing I often struggle with, because I'm realizing, particularly this past week, and I don't want to inflict this on people, frankly, how bad most of us are at showing care in moments like this. I just give you an example, and it's not judgmental, because I understand the intention's good, but I'm realizing how much intention and impact can be different in these situations. Like, I was at clergy conference, and a priest who I have a relationship with came up and said, "I'm so sorry for your loss," right? And I get the intention, and I chose to say, well, I'm not particularly sorry. There's other words that probably better describe that. Response I got back: well, losing your parent is always so hard. I mean, yeah, I got preached to. I didn't get listened to. And I realized that, in general, people probably don't want to know how I feel, because they don't ask. Or we don't have time in an exchange in a hallway, because there is no container of time there, And so, like, I'm starting to think, like, my first reaction to people is, "I'm sorry for your loss." And I need to change that to, like, "I don't know how you're feeling, and if you'd be willing to share, I'd be grateful to listen." And that's weird, because it's not the normal response. And the normal response is full of good intention. It's just, I know that for people who are difficult like me, it puts us in a position of taking care of the other person instead of being cared for. Like, if somebody says, "Well, I lost my dad and it was so hard," that's about you. So really what you're doing is, you think you're comforting me, but you're asking me to comfort you, because I have to accept your narrative about what this is like. And if I challenge your narrative, I'm going to push you back into grief. But I didn't need your narrative. I don't know if that makes sense. How you say that is really, really tough, because, of course, like, I know the intent is really good. And most of the time I just say thank you, because that's easier. And I understand, like, I understand the intent, but I also am now increasingly aware of the impact of even what I do, right? What I do is I say, like, a more or less a better or worse platitude to somebody. And there's probably times that's appropriate. I mean, I've talked to people and, like, I really appreciate that. Like, I actually appreciate people saying you're in my thoughts or prayers or whatever. Like, that's nice to hear. And we can't be perfect all the time, and we don't have time to do it all the time. I understand all of that. But I never quite know how much people want to go on this trip, because I do kind of believe this is not just about me. This is how we take care of other people, or don't.
Well, part of that, don't you think, is how we've been programmed from being a child? I mean,
Yes.
our responses are, are already part of who we are. And to stop and to think about that is something that, I don't think just kind of happens.
And I think that goes right back to what we were talking about at the very beginning, with sin being myelinated neural pathways. I mean, we grow up with these phrases: "Oh, he's in a better place. He's not suffering anymore. This must be very difficult. I'm sorry for your loss." And of course, again, the intent of all those things is fine. It's just that there might be some better ways we could do that, but we've traveled that road so many times on TV and books and movies with each other. I mean, you go to try to find a card, is it like a sympathy card, and the choices aren't great because they're all of this same kind of script, like it's all the same kind of thing. I got a different kind of card. This one's really sweet. The world needs your voice. It needs your talents. It needs you. Hope you can feel everyone encouraging you every step of the way. Now that is a really different kind of empathy card.
Very lovely.
I actually think that was not in the sympathy section. That was probably in the graduation section. And it's interesting. There's some, and of course, I don't doubt the intention at all. It just comes back to what's the impact.
That goes back to my thinking that
You were going to say.
it's a gift to us that you've given us a learning opportunity to explore our ineffective ways, to explore better ways, to explore our own feelings about death, to explore all of this stuff is coming up, and it's good stuff. It's uncomfortable stuff, but it's stuff that we can grow by dealing with. And that's because you've chosen to be real with us to a certain degree of what is appropriate for you and what you're
Thank you.
comfortable with.
I really appreciate that. I do. Thank you.
Mike, I liked it a lot when you indicated to us, I think it was at a mass, to wait 2 or 3 weeks or 3 months or something down the road, and then say something or do something, or put flowers on the church in the vase just because it's a church, it's a holy space. That was very wise on your part and helpful to me anyway.
Thank you. And that wasn't necessarily my own idea. I've just been around people long enough that that's what they say,
Okay.
And
Okay.
so, I mean, I'm like 2 weeks out on my own event, right? But most people I know, like, they resonate with that idea that if you have to pick between now and later, pick later. Since we don't have to pick, do now and do later.
It was the first time I have heard it, and I'm an old person. I had never heard that, and that was.
I mean, that's our job, really, isn't it? To share, like, how do we take care of each other? And for me to do it and fail, that's okay. The question is, what did I learn? And oh God, I hope I learned something. And if I can pass that on, or we could pass that on to each other, imagine how much better we'd all be at this, which is like the whole point, right? Is we want to take good care of each other.
Can I make a suggestion? When people have passed away in the past year, we don't all remember their names or their addresses. If there would be some place that we could go to get that, so we could send them a card.
That's an interesting thought. I will tell you this, the fastest way you're going to see that is next Sunday on November the 7th, because you're going to see all their names in the litany of the departed.
Right.
But that is an interesting thought, Tim, like, how do we make that more accessible? Because I do encourage people to do it, but if they're not tracking on their own throughout the year, that might be harder. Mm-hmm. So that's an interesting thought. Maybe that I should put down each month, like, this is the 3rd month of so-and-so's,
And because we have the name, we may not have the address.
That's right, unless they're in the directory. That's fair.
Yeah.
I need to think through that, because again, that is a way of empowering all of us to do the care that we want to do. Yeah, thank you. Did you notice that Moses changes God's mind? I just want to be clear on that. I don't even know what to make of that story. And notice that God is actually kind of like a petulant child. And the way Moses does it is like, this will be bad for your reputation. People will not think highly of you for doing this. Not like this is outside your character, or hey, I know you would never do this, and I'm just thinking you might do this because that's how I would be. There's none of that. There's like God's anger burns against the people. That's a tough primal story. I mean, I choose to believe it's not right, but and that prayer does not in fact do this, because it'd be really hard to think about praying ever again. I mean, it just would be really hard.
Well, God gets talked out of a lot of things in the Old Testament. It's like,
Yeah.
That's something I just am hard to understand, how you talk to God and God changes his mind when he's supposed to know everything before it happens.
The only thing I can think of, Tim, is when I legitimately pray, prayer changes me, not God, and God has changed my mind to God's mind.
Mhm.
But I think a story like this does the flip-floppy thing, and that's weird. That's weird. I mean, I don't feel like I need to tell God, like, hey, children suffering is not a good thing. Like, I sort of think God's astutely aware of that. So the question is, like, what's happening with my awareness of that on God's behalf? In some ways, like, we represent God. So in what ways are we representing God? Well, I know that's not how the story reads, but that's the best I can do with it. There's also this weirdness. I don't know if you notice, God says, you can't see my face and live. But a few verses prior to that, God talks with Moses face to face. So then God's going to show Moses God's back. It's kind of weird. So you can see God's back and live. Seems like any visible manifestation of God's going to be challenging for you. The way the rabbis hear this story is just because God's always going in front of us. So we're always kind of following, or not. Hopefully we are, but that's why we can only see God's back.
Well, I guess then if you saw God's face, it would mean that you were going off the path, taking the other way, straying.
I don't know. I mean, because if I'm really honest, like a few times I've seen God's face in somebody else's, like short. But I feel like I have seen that. Those are like moments of rapture where like I'm wrapped up in something like ineffable. They usually don't last very long. And the longer I know that person, I'm like, boy, that was a miracle, because, I'm not sure you really like all of that, but it doesn't deny the experience that I got wrapped up,
There's something about a newborn baby that I think of God's face, or I have in the past too. When I birthed my babies, I hadn't thought about that now until you've just mentioned it, but that was a very pure experience.
Sleeping children are like that too. I mean, almost every parent I know, find their children more beautiful when they're asleep. There's this weird phrase God says, I'll travel with you, which is new, right? But I'm not going to be directly with you, or I might kill you. That's a tough phrase, right? That's a real tough phrase. Two other things, when I don't know if you've seen Michelangelo's statue of Moses. It's in Rome, and he has two horns growing out of his head. That's because when Jerome translated this passage into the Vulgate, he got to this thing about glory coming off Moses's face, which is a particular word, and he sort of chose the wrong definition, which is grew horns. So it ought to read that his face shines with the glory of God, which in Hebrew is a feminine word called the Shekinah, like it's the residual glory of where God's been. The saints kind of have the Shekinah glory, but Jerome put that as horns. So you know, like we make little mistakes sometimes. Every translation is an interpretation, and Jerome missed that one.
He should have seen Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments then.
You got it. Well, see, consider that the Ten Commandments was written with the benefit of the Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts having been discovered, right? If the Ten Commandments had been made in the 1800s, Moses would have grown horns out of his head. And it's funny, right, that Moses chooses to wear a veil. He chooses to veil that he's been in God's presence. It sort of reminds me about like, there's this like thing about humility. Most people think humility means like deprecating yourself, but there's this Harry Potter story where Severus Snape, who's like this kind of tough teacher, used to be on the bad team and he converts to the good team, but he tells Dumbledore, who's like the Jesus figure, hey, like you can't ever tell anybody why I've switched over. And Dumbledore says, how sad to keep the best part of you away from everybody. You know, it's sort of interesting to think about what veiling the best parts of ourselves really does for everybody else. And there's a difference between boasting and just being transparent. All right, one last thing I want to call out, and I know you've got some other things, but it seems important to call out, or sorry, two last things. There's this, all of a sudden in the middle, you can't boil a kid in its mother's milk. And I just want to remind you that it probably means you can't cook a kid in its mother's fat, so you can't kill both generations at once. Otherwise, you have no more goats left. But that the reason we do milk is because rabbinic history says that God told Moses orally this other Torah that was not written down. It was passed down rabbi to rabbi. And in that oral version, you should hear this word as milk, which makes no sense. Like it makes no sense why you couldn't combine meat and dairy. Like that just makes no sense. But the decision is it doesn't need to make sense. It's the oral Torah says that's how to translate it. Any Hebrew scholar you meet is going to tell you that word should be fat. But the oral Torah says that it's milk.
Who has the oral?
Well, it sort of got written down. That's the Babylonian Talmud, or like the Toledo and Talmud. That's where you'll find it. But before like printing and before literacy was widespread, it was like rabbis' secrets. And so the rabbis could say, like, this is the oral Torah. Well, we don't read that in the Torah. No, of course you don't. This was what God told Moses, that Moses told his kids and his kids and his kids, and it's come to me as your rabbi. It's insider knowledge.
Or it could be interpretation.
Yeah. Yeah, probably that's what it is. But then you put some authority behind it.
Yes.
Yeah. Sort of like when the Pope speaks ex cathedra. I don't want to question that, but does he really have a special line to God? I just find that kind of hard to believe, because, I find that hard to believe.
As a Catholic, I find it hard to believe too.
The bishop did this really cool thing when he was here in May. He said, one of the problems with evangelical movements is that they're all about reading the Bible by yourself. But at the beginning of the Reformation, the Bible was meant to be read and interpreted in community, which really checks a lot of ways we can kind of derange the scriptures by being the sole interpreter and thinking, how does it meet my needs exclusively? When you have a community, then you get to have a conversation.
Well, it's very interesting. I just read something here in the Times where the word evangelical is becoming a clue word for Republicans.
And that's happened since the 70s. It's actually like an intentional thing that was happened to galvanize power. It's not a religious thing, and that's what's really sad. is that people have been manipulated and taken advantage of without even realizing that that's what politicians were doing to them, exploiting their religion.
And it seems to have taken hold a whole lot right now, and
Yes,
and scary.
that's scary.
It is.
Scary.
And instead of being mad at the people, they're pawns and frankly, a power play by politicians who frankly have no religion in themselves, but see an ability to take advantage of it. It's very, very unfortunate. Two other things to call out in Deuteronomy 6. This is like the Nicene Creed if you're Jewish. It's called the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, and you'll love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with everything left after those. That comes, and the Shema, one of the problems with us as human beings is that we forget. We just forget, like we're forgetful folk. That's why you have to like tie it around your forehead and on your wrist, and on your doorpost, and teach your kids in the morning before you go to bed, because we don't forget. And Christianity, that's not one of our major emphases, but it is in Islam. That's why you pray 5 times a day, to make sure you don't forget. So it's interesting that these other two Abrahamic faiths, right, sort of identify our core problem, not that we're evil or that we're fallen, but that we're forgetful. So much more positive, you know? So much more positive. When you read all these studies, right, where people watch a video and then you ask them, did you see that gorilla? If they weren't looking for the gorilla, they probably didn't see it. Because we're not actually as aware of things as we think we are, right? Like we tend to see what we're expecting to see. And so the Shema is a reminder, like, what are you expecting to see?
The first time we saw that, we were at the airport headed for Paris, and we saw a Jewish man put the little thing on top of his forehead, and we didn't know what to make of it. We had never seen that before.
Yeah.
And it's like, it seems so alien.
And it is relatively alien because most Jewish folk don't do that, right? That is usually a practice of more conservative Orthodox people, or it happens at your bar mitzvah only. These phylacteries, you know, and most Jewish folk I know, they don't wear the prayer shawl with all those seats coming out. That tends to be more conservative practitioners. So to find phylacteries in public is definitely not normal. I should tell you that.
And this was about 15, 20 years ago.
20 or 30 years.
About 20 years ago. But even then, it was, you know, people stood back and just kind of didn't know exactly what to think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like the first time I saw a lady in HEB wearing a chador, I was like, what the heck are you doing at El Camino HEB wearing that chador? Like, it's very strange. A chador is like a burqa, except without the face part. You know, it's really what Shiite Muslims tend to wear, right? It's not as restrictive as a burqa. One last thing, God says in Deuteronomy to give the land a break every 7 years, give it a rest. And then God says, if you don't, I will throw you off the land so that it can have a break. Now that's an interesting command. The land is going to get rest with or without you. Obviously, the planet has not had a rest in 7 years. So it's a little worrisome to hear that the planet might only get a rest without us.
That appears to be where it's headed right now.
It does appear. And then, you know, the geology is pretty clear. Like the land will get a rest. Like the system will take care of itself after we quit polluting it. It's interesting how thoughtful the scriptures are to be 3,000 plus years old, right? Like this will happen with you or without you, and you probably would rather be around.
is that same kind of philosophy or thought in, say, the Hindu or
I'm less familiar with like Hindu creation care, I have to admit.
Okay.
Any last thoughts for us? And sorry to be so lectury here at the end.
I found it fascinating to review those particular chapters again. It just kind of makes you take a step back and kind of rethink things sometimes.
Thank you. Ladies?
I don't have anything further.
I'm so grateful for your time and flexibility on a weird day. We'll be back next week on Wednesday. I'll put this in an email to us, but we're going to do 14 and 15 next week because they really are A, both short, and B, they're tied to each other. My thinking that they are anyway. So it's not considerably more work to do these two sections, which I think will draw out more from our time together. That'll be next Wednesday, and I will see you at 9. Thank you, everybody.
Hi, everyone.
Peace.